the IRS to give them cash for R&D or research and development tax credits. So the billionaires wanted government handouts while the rest of the United States was out of work and confined to their homes, receiving a measly $1,200 stimulus check. Not only that, but Jeff Bezos actually started a relief fund for his employees during this time that encouraged everyone to donate to his contract employees and delivery drivers during the lockdown. So not only did Bezos, who is on track to become the world's first public trillionaire, ask for handouts from the government, but he also asked for donations from peasants to keep his employees paid. Keep in mind, the tiny mom-and-pop restaurant down the street from me gave away free food to those who were hungry during the lockdown, no questions asked. But billionaires asked for handouts from the public to fund their companies. And now it's come out that the 5 wealthiest Americans, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, and Larry Ellison, saw their wealth grow by a total of $101 billion over the last few months. The time and the motivation to start asking questions to better understand the world around them, resulting in a worldwide awakening of sorts. Or at least a whole new wave of people who began questioning the talking heads speaking to them from the little black boxes in their living rooms. So before we get into all the strange things that happened in 2020, let's dive into the story of the Emperor's New Clothes. A story about conformity and obedience to authority, which ultimately yields in deception. Most importantly, deception of the self. So here we go. This is the tale of the Emperor's New Clothes. In a faraway land in a kingdom which stood long ago, there existed a rather vain emperor who loved all of the luxuries of life, especially fine clothing. It was rumored he had a different coat for every hour of the day. These rumors traveled to distant lands and attracted 2 unassuming swindlers who journeyed to his city, claiming to be one of the best clothes makers in all of the land, saying they made magical clothing that would appear invisible to anyone who was stupid or incompetent. The emperor was delighted and eager. He couldn't wait for this new amazing magical outfit, and second to that, he was excited to see who was unfit to be in his kingdom, as they wouldn't be able to see his outfit. He paid these men handsomely to construct his magical outfit, and snickering knowingly, the con men pretended to sew and stitch with empty looms and threadless needles, and when the emperor sent a couple of his men to go check on the garments, his men saw absolutely nothing. No cloth and no fabric. But they didn't want to admit they saw nothing because they feared accusations of stupidity and incompetency. On the day of the great procession, the clothing was presented to the emperor. But when the clothing was handed to him, he saw nothing. But the emperor withdrew any remark, fearing the label of stupidity or incompetency. After all, he was the leader of this empire. He could risk no such thing. His staff dressed him from head to toe in the garment, and then, in all of his glory, the emperor marched in the great procession in front of all of his subjects. Of course, his subjects had caught wind of the magical nature of the clothing, and not wanting to be called stupid or incompetent, they too told the emperor how beautiful the clothing was, even though what they saw before them was a butt-naked man. Finally, a child piped up and hollered, "But he's not wearing anything!" The crowd turned to the child, realizing the young boy had no agenda or reason to lie, so what the child was saying must be true. It confirmed what they too had seen but were too afraid to speak on. All at once the crowd started chanting, "He's not wearing anything! He's butt naked!" Thus, the emperor returned to his quarters, wearing nothing but his pride. The end. So, internet friends, I want to ask you, has there ever been a time this year, or any time really, when you were too afraid to speak up when you saw the truth right in front of you for fear of the judgment or the ridicule you might encounter from your peers? Perhaps you didn't speak up because you didn't want to be labeled a conspiracy theorist or something like that. And as a broader question, from whom have we accepted these facts without question? And for how long? And where has this gotten us as a society except for living together in a collective lie? I covered a story back in February about how a record number of major American CEOs stepped down at the beginning of 2020. There were many theories as to why these CEOs had been leaving in droves over the last year. peaking at the beginning of this year, ranging from theories like they had offices in China and saw the detrimental effects of the virus on the Chinese economy, so they had to get out of Dodge before things got bad, to the theory that they were tipped off by insiders to cash out on their stocks while prices were high and about to plummet from the economy shutting down, to the theory that these individuals might be bailing out before feeling the full force of an executive order signed in 2017 that authorized the seizure of assets of people and organizations involved in human rights abuse and corruption. Among the CEOs who stepped down were the CEOs of Disney, MasterCard, L Brands, otherwise known as Victoria's Secret, Uber Eats, Hulu, MGM, IBM, Salesforce, and LinkedIn. The Nestle CEO, Lockheed Martin, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, BlackRock, Nokia. You get the picture. You've got a good mix of corporatocracy, juggernauts, banking creatures, and government contractors. A record number of CEOs left their positions within 2 months' time in 2020, but really this was a trend over the past year or so. In 2019, over 1,300 high-level CEOs had left their positions, even during record stock market highs, and apparently the last time such an influx of corporate resignations occurred, the year was 2002. But what's most interesting about these CEOs who stepped down at the beginning of 2020 was that their company stocks peaked in early February and tanked in March. So if these corporate executives did have knowledge that the economy was going to take a major hit, then by resigning in January and February, this allowed these corporate CEOs to cash out on their company stocks that they would otherwise be forced to keep while employed at the company. Moving right along, it was also at the beginning of the year that the richest people in the world were making big moves. Jeff Bezos unloaded $4.1 billion worth of Amazon shares in February. And Bill Gates stepped down from the Microsoft board of directors in March to pursue his own personal brand of philanthropy. On March 21, 2020, it was reported that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos had asked for government funding to the tune of $5 billion in grants or loans to keep commercial space company employees on the job and launch facilities open. Since, of course, Elon Musk runs SpaceX and has a net worth of $42 billion, Jeff Bezos is founder of the aerospace company Blue Origin and has a reported net worth of $163 billion. Both Elon and Jeff Bezos wanted the IRS to give them cash for R&D or research and development tax credits. So the billionaires wanted government handouts while the rest of the United States was out of work and confined to their homes, receiving a measly $1,200 stimulus check. Not only that, but Jeff Bezos actually started a relief fund for his employees during this time that encouraged everyone to donate to his contract employees and delivery drivers during the lockdown. So not only did Bezos, who is on track to become the world's first public trillionaire, ask for handouts from the government, but he also asked for donations from peasants to keep his employees paid. Keep in mind, the tiny mom-and-pop restaurant down the street from me gave away free food to those who were hungry during the lockdown, no questions asked. But billionaires asked for handouts from the public to fund their companies. And now it's come out that the 5 wealthiest Americans, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, and Larry Ellison, saw their wealth grow by a total of $101 billion over the last few months. Before the stock market crash on February 20th, 2020, members of Congress engaged in an insider trading scandal using knowledge that was given to them at a closed Senate meeting. And they sold off their stocks right before the stock market crash. And ultimately, there was an investigation, but it was just one big show and nothing came of it. It appears members of Congress can trade using insider information with impunity. Unlike an executive in the private sector who buys or sells stock in their own company, members of Congress do not have to file a Form 4 with the SEC. So by law, they don't have to disclose their activity. 94% of Congress are now multimillionaires, and the average salary of a U.S. Senator is $174,000. Rules for thee, but not for me is the motto of our government, regardless of partisanship. Laws that apply to the common people, but not the privileged few. And I don't know about you, but that doesn't exactly spell out representative democracy to me. Unless I guess it's a representative democracy of corruption. 10 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation introduced a report called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. that outlined how the world would look in various scenarios, how those scenarios could impact the development of technology, and curiously, one of those scenarios was a global pandemic. Through each of these hypothetical scenarios, the Rockefellers painted 4 different outcomes for the future of the world. One future of a global pandemic was called lockstep, which they defined as a world of tighter top-down government control and more authoritarian leadership with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. But it's important to note that the traditional definition of lockstep is a standard method or procedure that is mindlessly adhered to or that minimizes individuality. The Rockefeller hypothetical scenario from 2010 focuses on a H1N1 outbreak, an influenza strain originating from geese, and in this future, a hypothetical future, H1N1 infected 20% of the global population, killing 8 million people in 7 months. The Chinese government's swift lockdown measures and enforcement of mandatory quarantine for all citizens as well as hermetic sealing of their border yielded a favorable outcome, while the United States' initial policy of just discouraging citizens from travel proved too lenient, spreading the virus across the U.S. and abroad. As the pandemic progressed, national leaders took on authoritarian roles under the guise of protecting their citizens, which first started in the form of mandatory face masks and temperature checkpoints at train stations and supermarkets. But the funny part is that even after the pandemic was over, the worldwide authoritarian control remained. At first, citizens willingly gave up their privacy and freedoms in the name of safety and health. They begged for top-down control, and that's exactly what they got in the form of biometric IDs for all citizens and greater oversight of normal everyday activities. Science and innovation became completely controlled by governments. The lockstep scenario says that by 2025, the people regretted giving up their freedoms and allowing governments so much control and the ability to make choices for them. Fast forward to 2018, when Bill ran a pandemic virus simulation which he projected would kill 33 million people if the simulation came to fruition. 1 year later, in October of 2019, the Gates Foundation hosted Event 201 at the World Economic Forum in New York, which was a high-level pandemic exercise that played out a novel coronavirus pandemic with potentially catastrophic consequences, requiring cooperation between industries, governments, and key institutions. Johnson & Johnson was in attendance. As Event 201 was happening, the 2019 Military World Games were taking place, hosting 110 nations and thousands of military members from around the world, and none other than Ground Zero, Wuhan, China. Yes, you heard that right. The World Military Games were held in Wuhan, China, ground zero of the coronavirus, mere weeks before the first case was reported. In January 2020, a federal court unsealed indictments against a Harvard professor and chemistry department head Charles Lieber, along with 2 Chinese nationals. Prosecutors said that one of the nationals is a Boston University researcher who was a lieutenant in the People's Liberation Army, and the other was a cancer researcher who attempted to smuggle vials of biological materials in his sock. It was disclosed that Wuhan University paid Lieber $50,000 a month, and he was given over $1.5 million to establish a lab at Wuhan University. But don't worry, Snopes told us nothing strange was going on with Lieber, so we could rest easy and go back to being good little sheep. On February 28, 2020, Bill Gates called coronavirus the once-in-a-century pathogen we've all been worried about, as he sounded the alarm for world leaders to respond accordingly. In 2018, to the tune of $4.1 million, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded a biotech company called Oxitec that aimed to successfully deploy a self-limiting mosquito strain designed to reduce the spread of targeted diseases. I've been following this story for several years, and these genetically engineered mosquitoes have threatened to leave the lab several times, even with the United States military getting in on the action and the research behind this goal. But this latest update I became aware of through Spiro's recent video as well as Jeff C's coverage of these engineered mosquitoes, so shout out to them and I'll link those videos below. Basically, at the end of March 2020, the Environmental Protection Agency, otherwise known as the EPA, said it was going to suspend its enforcement of environmental laws and told companies that they would not need to meet environmental standards during the corona outbreak. So the EPA has suspended monitoring and enforcement of environmental regulations on American companies during the pandemic. If you want to pollute the earth, cut some corners, or engage in immoral practices that will have a negative consequence on the public at large, now's your time to shine. Oxitec, the same biotech company that Bill Gates bankrolled over the last few years, is seizing this opportunity to release millions upon millions of genetically modified male mosquitoes into the Florida Keys. The plan is the genetically modified male mosquitoes will hook up with the lady mosquitoes and produce artificially weak offspring that will never grow up. Sound familiar? And by doing so, this will reduce the overall mosquito population in the future. And since male mosquitoes don't even drink human blood, they're set to release these by the millions into the great unknown. And yes, it is truly the great unknown, because there are so many unknown factors in the sudden release of millions of mosquitoes in the United States, especially when mosquitoes already transmit disease. With no regulations or oversight, couldn't this massive experiment fall into the hands of someone who truly wants to reduce the population? And we're not talking the mosquito population. And the reason why you'll never hear any negative press about him from legacy media is because he literally bankrolls the news. A recent examination of the charitable grants that the Gates Foundation had made through the end of June found more than $250 million going towards journalism. And the recipients included the BBC, NBC, Al Jazeera, ProPublica, National Journal, The Guardian, Univision, Medium, The Financial Times, and The Atlantic. PolitiFact and USA Today, which are run by institutions which have received funds from the Gates Foundation, have even used their fact-checking platforms to defend Gates from false conspiracy theories and misinformation, like the idea that the foundation has financial investments in companies developing COVID vaccines and therapies. In fact, the Gates Foundation's website and most recent tax forms clearly show investments in vaccine companies.
Two.